Good. Now we are ready to, I think, to start our session. And Harry, you may be willing to say a few words and then to introduce Anni-Maria.
On behalf of the Finnish Patristic Society, I, as the secretary of the said society, welcome you all to this Zoom session. It's a privilege and honor to have such a historic moment here with all of you, to have a shared meeting with our Ukrainian colleagues, and it's really fantastic. We will, without further ado, I will ask the chairperson, the president of the Finnish Patristic Society, Dr. Anni-Maria Laato, to offer some introductory words for all of us. So if Anni-Maria is here, I can't see her now.
She is here.
Yes, I am here.
Okay. Thank you so much, and please welcome Anni-Maria Laato.
Thank you. And for my part, I also wish to welcome all of you to participate this session. We are really happy and for this possibility to have this cooperation and have this symposium together with our sister organization, the Ukrainian Patristic Society. And we hope that our cooperation will also continue even in the future. And I also wish to welcome all of you who possibly are not yet members of our societies, but you are also just as welcome as the members are. I will in the beginning say just a few words about our society, and then we will proceed to hear the papers of today. The Finnish Patristic Society is still quite a young scientific society. We recently celebrated our 10th anniversary. The Finnish Patristic Society celebrated, as we celebrated our university, the anniversary. So we also discussed our purpose in the scientific field. Our aims are to promote academic study of the early church and its literature. We organize symposia, conferences, and public discussions. The previous and upcoming topics can be found in our website, which Harry will introduce to you. Among the themes that we have discussed are, for example, deification, embodiment, Holy Spirit, and so on. An important part of our work is to publish scholarly articles and monographs and translations of patristic texts in our peer-reviewed publication series, Studia Patristica, Fennica. We mainly publish in Finnish language, but a few titles such as Harri Huovinen's dissertation on early Christian ecclesiology, which I will show here, are available in English. So welcome all.
Many thanks, Anni-Maria, and probably, I need to say one word on behalf of the Ukrainian Patristic Society. It's a true pleasure to have the Finnish Patristic Society as our sister organization, as our partner, and it's very important that we have this joint conference. We believe that it makes us, the Ukrainians, closer to Europe, and closer to Europe not just politically but also intellectually. So that's how we approach each other in different ways, including the patristic legacy. That's why the title of this conference is the two approaches to the same legacy that we share, and we believe that we do share the same legacy. So it's really a privilege for us to be a part of this conversation, and thank you for accepting our invitation to have this joint conference. So Harry, maybe you want to introduce our first speaker then. You need to unmute yourself.
Please, Professor, do introduce the first speaker yourself. Please continue.
Right. So I think according to our program, our first speaker will be Father Serafim. Father Serafim is really a towering figure in the Finnish patristic and I would say Orthodox patristic theology. He teaches at the University of Joensuu. He is also a clergyman of the Finnish Orthodox Church. He has published a lot. I think his field of studies is very wide and includes practically all Oriental traditions, non-Greek traditions and Greek traditions. So Father Serafim is really an encyclopedic patristic scholar. We had a chance to meet with Father Serafim recently in the defense of Harry's dissertation in Joensuu. It was really a very nice encounter, very nice meeting. So Father Serafim, without any delay, I give the floor to you, please. It is yours.
Thanks a lot. I enjoyed these words very much. Unfortunately, it's all over now. Let's see if I can share my PowerPoint. Now you should see my title. So, first I want to mention, because I'm from the University of Eastern Finland in Joensuu, that we have just recently signed a deal with the Catholic University of Ukraine in Lviv, and we will have the first visitor, I think, Taras Timo from Lviv in Joensuu just in a few weeks. So our cooperation is starting to grow in many fields. My topic today is this something which is very close to my heart for a long time. When I think of Ukraine, the first thing that comes to my mind is its incredibly rich Jewish history. The Hasidic Rebbes in places like Belz, Chernobyl, or Medjugorje, and in endless other places, they present a spiritual tradition which has been very fruitful for me personally, very profound one, a joyous one, learned and spontaneous one, which is rooted in ancient sources, but with incredible ability to apply ideas into practice in surprising and lively ways, and to breathe new life into old texts in ever-renewing ways. That's how it was, and that's how it is still after the Holocaust, wherever this tradition is alive. And personally, I have a temptation to say that if the leaders of the Orthodox Church had that kind of abilities, our church would be in a much better state today. But the reality is that as an Orthodox theologian, one must always be on guard when talking about Judaism. There may always be in the same room somebody who has been afflicted with anti-Jewish or even anti-Semitic disease. Finland is an easy case in this respect, but nowadays when we are living in the era of online pollution, mental rubbish does spread here too. Now I briefly introduce some of my recent articles in which I discuss Christian-Jewish matters from different angles. And here you can see the list of my latest articles on this field and some of the forthcoming ones that I'm going to introduce. And of these articles, let's say that 3 of them deal with problems, with negative aspects, Chrysostom and other problematic cases. And I can say that it's like a patristic failure in understanding of Judaism, failures and mistakes made by the church fathers, but also contextual and stylistic matters that one should take into account when reading writings like Chrysostom's anti-Jewish repulsive remarks and his attacks against, this is the heart of the question, against what? Not only Jews, but he was attacking against Judaizing Christians and also against lazy Christians and more enemies in his other homilies, heretical Christians. And one should really not pick up the remarks against Jews without considering his methods of attacking all the other kind of enemies as well. In this second article in this list, I analyzed rather carefully his approaches against three different kind of enemies in the same series of homilies. One observation is that he knew surprisingly little of the development of post-biblical Judaism. He was referring to biblical Judaism and his understanding of it. And so he ended up to use mistaken theological argumentation accordingly. And these are articles that are written from very, let's say, orthodox academic point of view. But I will concentrate more on the positive cases, the marked with green, which I find more inspiring and more fruitful. Because from the early sources and patristic sources, you can find many kind of approaches, even ones that have not received enough attention or attention at all in studies on this field, though those studies are plentiful. The fourth article, Portrayal of Jews in Syriac and Early Byzantine Mystical Literature, is a nice example in this respect, because I noticed that the big amount of works written about patristic approaches to Judaism, they only deal with the church fathers and the bishops. But actually, for many, it's the spiritual, mystical, ascetical literature, which is the heart of the Orthodox and patristic theology. So I think it should be taken into account and given some weight in this discussion. And in this article, I went through 4 or 5 Byzantine and Syriac main authorities in spiritual and ascetical matters, concentrating on what did they say on contemporary Jews. That means not biblical Jews or not matters of biblical interpretation, but the living Jews of their time. Of course, they didn't say much because it wasn't their practical problem in any way. But always when they spoke something about contemporary Jews, it was either normal, neutral, or positive. Urges to love them, show love to them, urges to be able to cooperate them and not create problems by excluding them, and so on. These quotations here, the first one is from Isaac of Nineveh, where he encourages one to consider everyone worth of goodness and honor, whether he was a Jew, disbeliever, or a murderer. Of course, this looks bad to put Jew in association with disbeliever and murderer. But if there was a problem in Christians' attitude against Jews, what else could Isaac do if he wanted to improve this attitude than to write this way? So I think we shouldn't blame Isaac of this. The second quotation is from John of Sinai, whose style is a bit difficult because it's like a collection of aphorisms without context often. But anyway, he presents some nice wordings which an anti-Jewish author would never say, like this idea here that Mary perfects the synagogue. I remember when I quoted this sentence in the Patristic conference in Oxford, how the pen of Susan Arvid Ashbrook was moving very fast. She liked this idea very much. And the last example is about Barsanupius and John. A Christian layman asked whether it is a sin to press Jewish wine in his wine presser. And the answer these elders gave is that when God lets it rain, and it rains in your field, but not in that of the Jew, then do not press his wine. But if he lets it rain to everybody, then don't make a problem out of this. be merciful, even as your Father in heaven is merciful. So this kind of attitude, which is like a Christian, rational, normal attitude, but unfortunately, this is news that there are such remarks in Christian writings, because there are so many negative ones. So the result of this paper was that this kind of authors do not reveal any anti-Jewish attitudes against actual Jews as persons, even though they may be more or less critical against some real or imagined aspects of Jewish religion. But they urge their fellow Christians to show forth love for Jews and even encourage cooperation with them in everyday matters. Now I move to a paper which will come out this year in Parole de l'Orient, and this is an example of a rare case where we can find a Christian author being positively inspired by rabbinic Judaism and Jewish context around him. So here the main idea is that Ephraim the Syrian writes about the day of Christmas and Epiphany, Christ's birth and Epiphany, and he mystifies the day a lot, and he praises the day and attributes it with personification, even deification, and he speaks about this day in a very mystical way, and usually Christian authors do not speak about any day like this. So my idea in this paper is that he was inspired by the conceptions of contemporary rabbinic Jews on Sabbath, because all these kind of thought mechanisms are found from early rabbinic sources. Now, some of them, and many of them actually date back to times a bit later than Ephraim, and it's not my idea to show any literary influences as such, but the whole idea that if you are living next to a Jewish neighborhood, then the first thing you realize about them is the significance they give to Sabbath in practical terms, and if you have any contact with them, it's one of the first topics to discuss, really, in that kind of surroundings. Namely, Ephraim's hometown Nisibis is mentioned in the Talmud among the early rabbinic academies, so there was a very strong Jewish presence there. And anyone who lives in that kind of town cannot fail to see the influence of Sabbath for the Jewish life and thought. And also we know from the other sources that Syriac-speaking Christians and also Greek-speaking ones in Antioch, they were concerned with the Jewish Sabbath, both the practical and the theological significance given to it. Some authors, like Afrahat, reacted in very polemic tune, but I argue that Ephraim responded by deepening the Christian understanding of their own feast days and sanctification of time through them instead. So Ephraim got some inspiration from the presence of the Jewish Sabbath around him. And in the red, you can see some of the quotations, how he praises that day and attributes it with this kind of characteristics. So Ephraim's idea is that Christmas Epiphany is an exceptional day through which one may participate in the riches of God and gain some mystical sanctification from the cosmic and heavenly depth of the day. And this all is very similar to the Jewish mystification of the Sabbath, which is found also from sources earlier than Ephraim or contemporary to him. Midrash rabbis is fruitful in this respect. And from this basic approach, Ephraim, just like the rabbis, end up with related notions in topics such as the duty to live in accordance with the value of the day. Rabbis go into great detail in this respect, Ephraim not, but the similar ideas are there. Ephraim's sacred day extends over the generations that have come and will come, he writes. And this is also the Jewish understanding and emphasis on the Sabbath. It's found already in the Torah and further developed in the Talmud. Both traditions have a day which surpasses time and represents eternity, a cosmic day, that is, like a sacred entity of time, which by its nature is connected with timeless realities. And for Ephraim, this sacred day, when one encounters it in the present moment, it opens up a direct connection with the original day of Christ's birth. So he writes, on your day, which is near to us, we have seen your birth, the distant one. And this parallels with the rabbinic understanding of Sabbath as something which recalls and reactivates the sacred moments when the Torah was given to Israel, which was the beginning of Sabbath in the earthly sense. And these both cases imply a kind of a spiral conception of time in which each sacred feast day opens up a connection to the day of the original event and activates it in the ordinary time. So the sacred day was eternal and also an archetypal source from which the other days receive their sacredness. And all the other days derive their goodness and beauty from the treasures of this original feast day. So for Ephraim, the sacred day of Christ beautifies and becomes beautified, presents unparalleled gifts. The activity of grace is more plentiful on that day, and so on. This all has loose parallels in the rabbinic understanding on the Sabbath. So the setting, in a way, it's very clear that here we have a church father living close to rabbinic academies and mystifying the sacred day of Christians in a very rabbinic way. But if Ephraim was directly influenced by some specific early rabbinic views, he managed to hide it rather masterfully. So this is more like parallelisms than causal influences in some specific literary sense. But I think this is relevant also in wider terms, because the Christian-Jewish issues in late antiquity typically represent either influences that are inherited from the distant biblical past, or distant liturgical past, if you will, or polemical attacks and their counter-attacks. But here we have something else. This is a rare case of a Christian author being positively inspired by post-biblical Judaism. Do I have time for one more article? Maybe. So let's have a few words about this one. Most of the early Syriac literature is written in a poetical form, and Sebastian Brock has edited and published a collection of Syriac poetry, where the Jewish community, the synagogue, is singing verse by verse with the church. So we have the synagogue, we have the church singing antiphonically in turns to each other. And this collection is an example of the possibility that in patristic times we may have a very friendly approaches to Judaism in Christian literature, again in Syriac. This first verse here is an example of this poetry, where we have the church singing, and here the main idea is that the suggestion, the church is singing to the synagogue, suggesting, let us inherit together, I and you. So this is probably the most positive thing you can imagine the church saying to the Jewish community. Of course, it's poetry, and this dialogical poetry represents a discursive form which is apt for tentative thoughts and possibilities that are not necessarily meant to be literal proposition. But however, the mere suggestion of sharing the inheritance, even in any symbolical or poetical form, it's quite exceptional among the early Christian writings of patristic times. And for some Christians, this certainly went too far, because we have a later manuscript of this hymn where a few verses have been written at the end, reading, let Zion be ashamed to speak, for the church has won, and the Zion has been vanquished. And this line tells more than it says, because reading the actual original text, it might remain a bit ambitious whether the church really won the disputation or not. Because usually in Syriac poetry, there can be a dialogue, a disputation, and always the good character wins and the bad one loses. But this poetry is a bit more open in this respect. Second example, here the church is singing, and it's not denying that the synagogue is loved by God. But here the interesting thing is again the last line, because the logic in this stanza is that the author first presents the problem, the Jewish adultery, and he hints at the traditional polemical solutions, which is the Christian means against the Jewish adultery. But instead of underlining the traditional Christian argument of blaming the Jews, here the author does something completely different. He rises above the polemical argumentation and continues with a prayerful line instead. May the Father have mercy on both you and me. This is a solemn solution, and it offers a rare case of a prayerful dictum for two different religions. And I think it's a rather unique moment in the textual word of late antiquity to have a word of prayer for two different religions. Okay, I'm slowly concluding. The last example I just show, another poetical verse where topic is very similar and terms are very similar, but this is a Jewish text. Eleazar ben Kalir, a 6th century Jewish poet from the Holy Land, so approximately the same era. I forgot to say that this poet is about 6th century. And he wrote a dialogue of Zion and God, Jewish community and God. And oddly enough, the Jewish community is in this Jewish poetry described at places in a very similar way than in this Christian hymnography, and at places even with more negative views, because it's full of self-critic. And this is one of my possible projects for the future, I hope I could say something more and something more specific about the relation between Jewish hymnography and Syriac Christian hymnography, because there seem to be some loose thematic parallels which are quite interesting. So, a brief mention of some problems and three positive examples of more a positive approach to Jews and Judaism in texts of the Patristic era. So I think this was my contribution today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Father Serafim, for to begin with the beginnings of our legacy, of our tradition, which is indeed rooted in the Jewish tradition. Thank you for introducing us also to your set of articles, your ideas, your findings about this. I think it is very helpful. And now it's time for questions. If you have questions, please raise your hands, and then I will give you a floor. Any question? Doesn't seem to. Annie Maria? Yes, please.
Yes, thank you, Serafim, for this presentation. I have a question. As you have read text from different time periods, so do you think there was in the early years in the late antiquity, was there a time window when there was this more positive attitude and these influences, and this time window was then closed? Or do you think there was for a longer period this kind of positive stream that was possible in Christianity?
Yeah, good question. It is also a matter of place and not only of time. So it must have varied a lot. But I think that the ones who are closest to each other, they are the ones who fight the most. So as long as there was a kind of a living debate on the borderlines of Christian and Jewish identity, it made it quite hot in both sides. But when the difference of the groups and their thought worlds and their literature and their authorities was fixed, then it was easier to have a neutral approach to each other, I believe. But this depends on the culture and of the political situation, because of course in Byzantium, when the Christians were ruling and the Jews were a small minority, then there is always the majority-minority problematic. But the Syriac Christians, the Syriac-speaking Christians, they were never in political position to rule other people or Jews. So they were both being ruled either from west or from the east. And I think that made it much easier to have a balanced and normal relation with each other. I think that's very crucial to begin with.
Thank you. I also have a question, Father Serafim. I wonder if you are aware, and probably you are aware, if you could elaborate a bit on this, on the parallels between the Babylonian Talmud and the stories from the Babylonian Talmud and the apophthegmata, as they flourish, particularly in Egypt. Of course, it's a kind of a relationship between the Coptic Christian literature and the kind of late antique Persian literature, Jewish literature. So if you have something to say about that, how that relationship worked, and could it be seen as a positive example of influence?
Yeah, I haven't studied apophthegmata from that point of view, but there are some very concrete parallels, even similar stories, which may be like didactic stories of late antiquity, and they were probably used in other religious traditions as well. But this apophthegmata is very nice literature because it's not really against anyone. Well, it's maybe against myself, but full of love towards all the others. And I think it's a problematic field to study because the most essential things are on the level of attitudes, and the this kind of literary dependencies are just small details. But I think there would be a lot of important topics to study in the field of this kind of basic approaches to spirituality and concepts of spirituality, which is not enough studied in this kind of comparative studies.
Thank you so much. So if we don't have other questions, I don't see any raised hand, then we should thank Father Serafim for his presentation, wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, Father Serafim. And we pass to another speaker, this time from the Ukrainian side. According to our program, is going to be Father Oleh Kindiy. Father Oleh is a professor at the Ukrainian Catholic University, which is going to be a partner of the University of Eastern Finland in Joensuu. Father Oleh is a prominent Ukrainian patristic scholar, and he will be speaking about the Ananke and Eleusis in Clement of Alexandria, an early Christian program of the freedom of human choice. Father Oleh, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, is everybody able to hear me? Sometimes my computer is acting strangely, so wonderful. I'm also very privileged and grateful for invitation to participate in this conference. I must confess that I missed the conferences, the international conferences. Unfortunately, the last 8 months have, put those burdens on us, and now I'm participating in, just catching a glimpse of fresh air. Some people like you, Father Cyril, are able to travel around the world. Some of us have to stay in, but nevertheless, we as humans are not afraid of difficulties, and we find ways to enjoy our academic life, not just be under stress. I must also confess that my presentation today was actually a reaction to what I saw from the Finnish side. So this is a dialogue between Ukrainians and Finns, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Siiri, Toiviainen. I apologize if I read it incorrectly. One of the next presentations will be on tracing or failing to trace the ancient roots of the principle of extreme necessity. I began to think myself, in terms of where are we between what we are doomed and how free are we? These are two extremes: fate on the one hand, and fate as something unchanged, and freedom as on the other side. And of course, I chose Clement of Alexandria as my hero to study because this is a person that I've dealt in my scholarship for many years. I prepared a short PowerPoint just to show the citations that I will be relying. So let me try to open it so that you can also see them. Is this something that you can all see?
Yes, we can, and you can put on the presentation mode. Yeah.
I will. Do this
and then you need to choose. You need to choose the window which to show. which to share.
Right.
Yeah,
Is
now
this-
it's coming.
Okay.
Yeah, it's good. Now it's good.
All right. This is just to provide, some of the citations that I will be relying. Is my text also shown on the screen, or just the PowerPoint? It's just a technical question. Everything's fine. So you just see the PowerPoint.
Yeah, we
Or-
can see the PowerPoint. Just the PowerPoint.
But you don't see my text. Okay.
No, just the PowerPoint.
Very good.
Unless
Very good.
unless you inserted your text to the PowerPoint.
No, I did not want to see my text. Okay, very good.
Okay, no,
So
we
let me
just see your-
proceed. Right. So Ananke and Eleusis in Clement of Alexandria, an early Christian program of the freedom of human choice. And allow me to read. This is something that I'm more used to in such serious platforms. In recent years, the ancient origins of the debate over such notions as faith and free will have attracted the attention of a considerable number of scholars. One of the most fascinating among them is the volume edited by René Brewer and Emanuele V. Mercati in their book called Faith, Providence, and Free Will, Philosophy and Religion in Dialogue in Early Imperial Age. In this volume, it is demonstrated how, during the Hellenistic period, the debate among philosophers had started with Stoics and Epicureans who took up the opposite positions. On the one hand, it was determinism. On the other hand, it was libertarianism. The academic skeptics joined in by attacking their dogmatic positions. In late antiquity, the debate was broadened. Platonists and Aristotelians, explicitly referring back to the writings of the founders of their schools, now venerated as authorities, developed their own dogmatic positions on the controversy. The debate broadened in another way, too. Members of the different religious groups, such as Jewish group, Christians, also Hermetics and Gnostics, became interested in the debate among philosophers, which provided them with rational justification of their beliefs. They started to rethink their own doctrines in terms of this debate, eagerly picking up on the philosopher's terminology related to the emerging notion of the free will. The debate in late antiquity turned out to be very influential. In this period, the discussion was continued by Greek and Latin church fathers, among whom can be singled out Origen, of course, Gregory of Nyssa, who wrote his treatise Against Faith, and Augustine of Hippo, who wrote on Free Will. In this context, Boetius was a transitional figure between antiquity and Middle Ages. In his writings, the ancient tradition culminated in the new, and a new era began. In his On the Consolation of Philosophy, he joined in the discussion and in so doing advanced it considerably. In High Middle Ages, voluntarists like Henry of Ghent and Duns Scotus argued for the independence of the will from the intellect. On the other hand, intellectualists like Thomas Aquinas defended the subordination of the will to the intellect. Aquinas sought a more balanced relationship between two faculties. In early modern period, the debate among determinism and freedom continued, with thinkers like Erasmus, Luther, Hobbes, Descartes, Spinoza, Locke, Leibniz, Hume, and many others. Even if the notion of providence had received less attention these days, the discussion between determinists, now often invoking recent insight in neuroscience concerning the operations of brain as evidence, and libertarians still rage on. Implications of this debate for ethics, political science, or political theology is also observable. It seems that limitation of human freedom may weaken social foundations of democracy, while determinism and heavy emphasis on providence or fate or historical necessity, as some of the terms we hear in political debates, may strengthen authoritarianism. Fate occurs in earliest Greek texts. Different words are used to refer to it, such as Moira, Hermamene, and Ananke. I will not go into details describing all of these terms. I chose the term Ananke because Clement of Alexandria referred to this term when he discussed Achilles' first part of his Oresteia. In order to sacrifice his daughter Agamemnon, he had to put on the harness of necessity, Anankas edu lepatnon. As I mentioned earlier, the debate among ancient philosophers had started with Stoics and Epicureans, who took up opposite positions, determinism versus libertarianism, while building on to Leucippus's and Democritus's atomism. Epicurus of Samos maintained that human beings are not subjected to mechanical necessity, but can have things in their own power. In his On the Nature of the Gods, Cicero formulated in the following manner: he, Epicurus, invented a way to escape from necessity, which clearly had escaped Democritus. He said that the atom makes a very slight swerve. There is a free movement in atoms, which Democritus failed to discover, but Epicurus brought to light. This free movement Epicurus called the swerve, paranclesis, or clinamen in Lucretius's Latin translation. According to Cicero's account in his On the Nature of Gods, the swerve would allow that we as humans have things in our power. It follows that human beings need not be bothered by the traditional accounts about the gods or about faith. On the other hand, in the interconnectedness of Stoic thought, doctrines of physics, including theology, are closely related to the other two parts of philosophy distinguished by the Stoics: logic, including epistemology, and ethics. In their epistemology, the Stoics hold that only the sage, as the perfectly rational being, will always deal correctly with his or her sense impressions. Building on these impressions and with the help of his correctly functioning faculty of reason, the sage will thus be able to have knowledge. In their ethics, the Stoics hold that the good life consists in living according to nature, that in the life in which one has brought one's own nature in accordance with the nature of the whole. Since it is only the sage that can have knowledge also of the operations of his own nature in relation to the nature of the whole, it is only the sage who can live the good life. Human beings who have not yet developed their rationality to perfection are not always able to understand the order of things, let alone able to consistently live in accordance with it. The non-sage's incorrect judgments about the course of things will affect their lives in a negative manner. The Stoics call these incorrect judgments emotions, which include anger and fear. They thus analyze anger as the non-sage's incorrect judgment about how he or she is affected by order of things, and fear as an incorrect judgment about how he or she may be affected. Pia di Simone insists that the philosophical religious debate about faith and freedom arguably culminated in the discussion between anti-Christian Celsus and Origen. Di Simone demonstrated how Celsus's view supports a Middle Platonist understanding of providence, though possibly influenced by Aristotelian debate and addressed against the supposed divine power of Jesus as proclaimed by Christians. Whereas on the other hand, Mark Edwards shows how Origen defends a Platonist conception of providence, though adhering to Christian beliefs. So on the one hand, we have Stoics, on the other hand, we have Epicureans, and then in between, we have many actors who are going in different sides. Origen would be considered for Christians as the one who solved this problem in the way that later was conceived by the Christians as standard. In the evolution of this debate, a special role is played by Clement of Alexandria, supposedly a tutor of Origen, or if they never really interacted between each other, Clement's synthesis of philosophical and Christian traditions left a visible trace in Origen's thinking. George Karamonolis elaborated on the question of early Christian interest in the notion of the free will. He says that free will, human responsibility, and divine providence are as central in the thought of early Christian philosophers as they are for their pagan contemporaries, Epictetus, Alexander, and Plotinus. Already in Justin Martyr, the first Christian philosopher, he exhibits a strong interest in this network of issues. This interest remains unfailing and gradually increases among the following generation of Christian intellectuals, such as Irenaeus of Lyon, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, and it reaches, as I mentioned earlier, a peak in the work of Origen. The question of human free will is crucial for deciding how man relates to God, humans relate to God, and how the world and to the world, and how God relates to humanity and the world. Was God free to make the world as he wished, or was he constrained by external exigencies, such as those that matter sets, as in the case, as is the case in the Timaeus, for instance? God's freedom of choice was important, especially because humans are created in the image of God according to Scripture, which means that if God's freedom of will is limited, so human freedom of will is also limited. The issue of God's freedom of will cannot be settled, though, merely by ruling out matter as a cosmic principle, as some Christian thinkers did. The problem persists since there remains the question of how evil or badness can be explained in the world if God is the only principle. There was a particular kind of evil, namely human vice, which occurs in various degrees, from occasional wrongdoing to deliberate or systematic vicious action, which requires special explanation given that humans are created in the image of God. These issues were highly debated by early Christians and pagans alike. Both had to face the challenge of two main contemporary currents of thought, that of determinists and Gnostics, of course. Early Christian thinkers were concerned with refuting views of astral determinists and those of the Gnostics, who were fellow Christians. The reason for their concern was mainly that such views severely distorted the way God relates to humanity and the world. The argument of early Christian thinkers was beset with great difficulties for two main reasons. First, because Scripture doesn't contain a discussion of those issues, but several important hints, such as Jesus' saying that man's spirit is willing, but the body is weak, as we see it in Matthew and Mark. Or famously, Paul's remark in his letter to the Romans, such as the statement that he observes a law in his members, unlike the one in his mind. Scripture not only lacks a discussion of all the important issues in this area, but also lacks the relevant terminology which early Christians employ in their writings. In particular, I have in mind the terms to aphemin, proairesis, and autexousion. Right. Let me turn your attention now to Clement of Alexandria. He often repeats in his work that man is equipped with the power to make choices freely, which he calls autexousion or to aphemin. The following passage is indicative of the centrality of this topic in Clement's thought. Let me cite him in his Stromates. Virtue, however, is not up to others, but entirely up to us. One can prevent us from other things by opposing us, but this doesn't apply to our capacity of choosing in any way, even if one threatens as much as he can, because this is a divine gift that belongs to nobody else but to us. As a result, licentiousness is not believed to be a vice of someone else, but of the licentious one, while temperance is a good of one who can be temperate. The above passage makes two important points. First, the unconstrained capacity of choice is given to us by God, and it is a divine gift. And second point is that this capacity is a characteristic feature of human beings that makes them unaccountable for virtue and vice. Both points are quite common to most early Christian thinkers. Clement, however, distinguishes himself from the from his predecessors by claiming that the capacity to choose freely is the most essential function of the human mind, or if the ruling part of the soul, the hegemonikon, which is the reasoning part. Clement makes that clear in several passages. In his work, Quis Divus Salvator, or The Rich Man's Salvation, he discusses the role of riches in human life. And so he makes the following claim. We must not, therefore, put the responsibility on that which, having in itself neither good or evil, is not responsible, but on that which has the power of using things either well or badly according to its choice. And this is the mind of man, which has in itself both free judgment, criterion eleuteron, and freedom of choice, autexousion, to deal with that is given to it. The above passage is important not only for clearly stating that it is the human choice that turns something into good or bad, a claim reminiscent of Socrates' argument in Euthydemus and the Meno, but also the view that the mind, nous, is equipped with freedom of choice. Elsewhere, Clement suggests that this is actually a faculty of the mind, hegemonikon, and indeed the principal one, to which all other faculties are meant to be servants. Let me see if I have. What we do, what we do not do, either we do not do it because we cannot, or because we do not want, or because of both, the will to bulistai then has always the first role. For the other faculties, the mind are meant to be its servants. In this passage, to bulistai is clearly more than a capacity to choose. It is a faculty of the human mind, and indeed one that dominates over all other faculties. And one relevant question here is what role this feature of the human mind plays to justify such centrality. It is important to note from the start that Clement brings up the issue of free will in the context of discussing Christian faith. Clement distinguishes between religion based on necessity, kat Ananke, and on choice, kata proairesi. And he maintains that the Logos enables man to choose his commitment to the Christian faith. Clement actually suggests that the human capacity to choose freely, to acousion, essentially exists so that humans can accept or deny the guidance of the Logos. This is a choice, proairesis, or sometimes he uses the word ekloge, that humans can make with their minds, hegemonikon, given human endowment with a deliberative faculty, proaritike dynamis. This choice is, of course, an act of will, but is not one of the ordinary choices we make in everyday life. It is rather a specific kind of choice, namely the choice of asserting to Christian faith, as the following passage suggests. Now, he says in his Stromata, book 4, now what is in our power is that of which we are masters, Kyrioi, equally as we are of its opposite. Like, for instance, whether we do philosophy or not, whether we believe or disbelieve. Since we are equally masters of each of the opposites, it becomes manifest that we have the capacity to choose freely. The term belief and disbelief in this context are used in this special sense of commitment or a lack of thereof of Christian doctrine. In the above passage, Clement suggests that our freedom consists in our ability to choose either of them, to believe or disbelieve, and more generally, in the ability to choose between opposite options. Justin Martyr, also makes this point, but he refers to any opposite courses of actions, while Clement refers specifically to the choice of following the Christian faith. Like all previous Christian thinkers, but unlike the Stoics, Clement takes the view that our freedom is expressed even when we make the wrong choice, even if we opt for the vicious or the wicked course of action. He points out, though, that such a choice can be avoided with the guidance of, or the exhortation we receive from God, the Logos. Clement elaborates on this idea, particularly in his Pedagogos and his Protracticus. He claims that man is not left alone to choose between following or not following God, between believing or disbelieving. Rather, Clement suggests that Logos stirs in us the desire to follow God and become like God. God's angels, Clement suggests, operate like the demons of Lachesis in the myth of Air in Republic, or in that they are sent to human souls to help people commit to their choice of life and fulfill it. Clement actually suggests that Socrates' daimon was something like an angel helping him to commit to the good. Clement claims, however, that there is no reason to think that there is a contradiction between God's callings and the choices we humans make, since it remains completely in our power to be convinced or not, to commit to the good and follow God's commands, or not to follow them. Wickedness arises in us because of ignorance or weakness, which drags us into a direction where we do not actually want to go. Clement adds that God appeals to everyone, although he knows that not everyone would follow him. Divine exhortations are merely a calling. Their acceptance and final endorsement depends on us. As with the Stoic cognitive impressions, they cannot make us do anything, but rather require our consent. There is a difference, however, between the Stoic theory regarding assent to cognitive impressions and Clement's theory of divine exhortation towards the aim of living a fully Christian life. According to the Stoic theory, assent is completely within our power, while the goal of living a perfect Christian life is not entirely within human reach. Clement suggests that fulfillment of this aim requires both our choice and God's assistance, God's grace, Eleusis. In other words, for Clement, the realization of human end to live a perfect Christian life, that is, to become like God, requires collaboration between humans and God. Perfection cannot be achieved by humans alone, but rather requires God's assistance. Human contribution in the project of reaching perfection lies in the assent to follow divine guidance and to what he can achieve, or he or she can achieve that goal. God responds to that human effort and intervenes to assist and then eventually to save humans. Clement makes the following remark by addressing the question of who can be saved, given the various powerful passions that trouble us, such as the passions of wealth. So let me cite from this work. But answers, that which is impossible with man is possible for God. This again is full of great wisdom, because when practicing and striving after the passionless state by himself, man achieves nothing. But if he makes it clear that he is eagerly pursuing his aim and is in deep earnest, he prevails by the addition of the power that comes from God. For God breatheth his own power into souls when they desire, but if they ever desist from their eagerness, then too the spirit given from God is withdrawn. For to save man against their will is an act of force, but to save them when they choose is an act of grace. Quite importantly, then, for Clement, the main task of human free will is to choose a specific kind of life and not merely to choose a certain course of action, as earlier Christians had thought. It is for this reason that Clement draws on Plato's myth of air in this context. For Clement, as for Plato, it is the choice of life, the kind of bios, that matters most, because it is this choice that largely determines all other subsequent choices. Given the importance of this choice, Clement tries to reconcile our freedom to make this choice with some kind of divine assistance that doesn't violate human freedom, but rather strengthens it. Quite clearly, with Clement, there is a clear shift in the argument of Christian thinkers regarding our ability to choose freely. The question is not so much whether we have such a capacity, but rather whether this capacity alone suffices to bring us to Christian perfection and salvation. We can now understand why the human will is so important for Clement, namely because through this we shape our characters, our lives, and decide what kind of persons we will be. This is actually what distinguishes the Christian wise man, gnostikos, from the others. That is, his will, to vulistai, determines his judgment and his actions. This is a step that paves the way for Origen's theory of free will, which aims to show that we are responsible for our characters and constitutions. According to Clement, the choice of life that our will makes also determines our future choices and our inclinations, and thus critically shapes our lives. So briefly to conclude, early Christian philosophers were strongly preoccupied with the question of free will and human responsibility. A close look at their arguments explains the reasons for their preoccupation. They wished to defend the view against those who argued that our choices are determined in this or the other way, that we have the power and the authority to choose, and that nothing can force our assent. Yet, while early Christian philosophers like Justin onward defend the human capacity of free choice and human autonomy, Clement takes the further step in making this capacity a faculty of the human mind, and indeed one that has the primary role in our mental life. This faculty is responsible not only for our individual choices in everyday life, but more importantly, for our choice of life. For Clement, this is the main choice we have to make, since this determines our lives in general. This implication is that this choice shapes our all further choices and also our temperaments and characters. For Clement, this choice is important also as an indication of our commitment to God. God's assistance for salvation respects that choice and further rewards it. Clement is an important link in the development of the theory of free will in early Christianity, and he paves the way, as I mentioned, for Origen's theory of free will, according to which we are responsible for our constitutions, characters, and inclinations. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that I fit my time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Father Oleh, for being precise in terms of time, and for your presentation, which actually introduces us to another source of our tradition, in addition to the Judaic tradition presented by Father Serafim. You brought to us another one, the Hellenic philosophy, the Greek philosophy, which constitutes another part of the patristic legacy. Thank you so much, and now it's time for questions from the group. Anyone wants to ask a question? Raise your hands, please. I don't see. Oh yeah, Siiri, please.
Well, thank you so much for your wonderful paper, which in a lovely way helps me soon proceed with my own. I just wanted to ask, maybe it's a question also that slightly arises from my own current research and perhaps some sort of more practical issues. What would, in your opinion, be like the sort of Clementine response to a person who is struggling a lot with like external circumstances and trying to sort of make good moral choices in that context, sort of maybe looking at this sort of patristic heritage from the perspective of some type of constructive theology? I'm not trying to challenge you. I'm asking out of curiosity if you see that this is a sort of, for example, a good pastoral starting point for approaching the choices that people make in their Christian lives.
Right. Well, there is a divine plan, as I see it in Clement, that I showed that in my dissertation, that Christ plays several different roles. At first, Christ is the one who invites, then he is the one that educates the character, and then the third stage would be he teaches the mysteries of God. And that first stage is wonderful because Christ is described as a singer. So Clement refers to aesthetics, to liturgy, I would say. So when a person enters a space where the real beauty is appealing to his or her own heart, then there is that internal desire to connect the internal logos with the logos, and the Christians are there to witness, the connection between these two ends, so to say. And I think that there is a constant invitation that comes from Christ to every person. So every person in his or her life has a chance to stand before God and wake up, so to say. That's a kind of a Gnostic term, but Clement also refers to it. So there's always a chance to exercise that internal freedom to go out of the state of being enslaved by sin, or by demons. But yeah, how it happens, this is a kind of an individual case. So everyone actually has the rights to accept or to reject, but it's also a responsibility of Christians to share, to speak out loud about God's philanthropy and God's willingness to embrace and to show a new life, so to say, show a new perspective to life. For Clement, Christianity is not just another philosophy. Christianity is the philosophy that brings the best of all the philosophies, as you know. So that's a quick response to your wonderful question. I'm really looking forward to what you will have to say on that subject.
Thank you so much. Any other question to Father Oleh? Actually, I have a question, Father Oleh, to you. I'd like to refer to the famous hypothesis by Deal that in antiquity, the idea of volition was inseparable from the intellectual capacities of a human being. So in Clement, you somehow addressed it, but I'd like you to elaborate a bit more, maybe to focus a bit more on this.
Well, right.
In Clement of Alexandria, to what extent do you see that he differentiates between the volitional capacity of a human being from his or her intellectual capacities, or they are still mixed up for Clement?
Volitional capacity, you mean, right?
Volitional, yeah, will, yeah, human will.
Yeah. Well, again, it's part of the human logos. So everyone is endowed with reason, because we are made in the image of God, and God is the pure reason. And we are made in the image of God, so we reflect in ourselves also the ability to choose freely. This is the main condition for communication, to ability to love, to grow, to become humans. So he doesn't go into very details of to decipher what is mind and what is volition. For him, it's the part of logos. That logos from the lowercase l, right? There is a logos of the Son of God. He is the exemplary. He is the logos, and we simply receive the. Well, not just receive. We are made in the image, so it's within us. Apologies, my dog is barking. But they actually go hand by hand. When a person studies scriptures, for instance, this is a kind of internal exercise. In Clement, it is important to study. He is a founder of a school not only on scripture, but on school just to know what is education. So for him, Christianity is an intellectual exercise as well. So when one is educated, then his choices are becoming refined. And on the other hand, you cannot educate yourself better if you choose wrong teachings, so to say. So they actually, I would say, go side by side, without giving preference to voluntarism or intellectualism. It's more balanced, but I would have to look into that more. Okay.
Well, would you agree then something that I intend to accept, that Clement from this perspective belonged to the era of antiquity by putting together intellectualism and voluntarism, kind of volitional, seeing volitional capacity as a part of logos. Good, thank you for your answers. Thank you for your presentation, Father Oleh. And I think, Harry, do you want to introduce our next speaker from the Finnish side?
Thank you so much. I will happily do that if I will get my machine working properly. I seem to experience some problems here with my computer right now. So if you could please continue, that will be.
Well, we can actually hear and we can see well. So it doesn't.
Yes.
There are no problems with your computer from our side.
Okay. So on this side there seems to be some problems. So if you could continue, I would be very happy.
Well, actually, you will be in a better place to introduce Siiri.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Siiri Toiviainen is an accomplished scholar of late antiquity, and she is working at the University of Helsinki, and she's also a board member of the Finnish Patristic Society, and she has received her doctorate at the Durham University, I believe, and she currently resides in Oslo, Norway. And she's also, in spite of that, she's very active on the Finnish side as well. So we will hear her presentation that has a lot to do with the topic that we just heard from Father Oleh. And as I mentioned, I have some problems with my computer, so I can't. Right now, I can't find the text of your the topic of your speech, of which I apologize. But you may probably introduce that yourself. So please welcome Siiri Toiviainen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Harry, for the introduction. And it's absolutely a pleasure and privilege to take part in this conference or seminar today. It's wonderful to have our Ukrainian colleagues and Finnish colleagues here together. I'm sort of painfully aware that the topic of my talk today may seem awfully sort of theoretical and far removed from real life to those people who actually in a more immediate way grapple with the realities of extreme necessity in the world of our day, not only in Ukraine, but also, for example, in light of the recent happenings in Turkey and Syria. So I very much take into account the sheltered and privileged perspective from which I'm speaking, and also, of course, respect the sort of real life stories that have to do with the same reality. I will just see if I can make my slides visible. Let us see. Maybe there. Can you see them now? Yeah. So my topic today is tracing or failing to trace the ancient roots of the maxim of extreme necessity, the patristic perspective on a multidisciplinary research project. I have to say also that, as I already mentioned, also that Father Oleh set the scene for this paper in a wonderful way. You will now immediately understand some of the difficulties that come with addressing this topic. I won't have to spend that much time talking about them. I also apologize that my paper today is not so much theoretical in nature. I'm more presenting a research project from which I, of course, hope to also have some more theoretical outcomes eventually, but I'm at the moment on parental leave, soon returning to work. So this is also slightly constrained by those realities, but I also bring you greetings from the Faculty of Theology at the University of Helsinki and can tell you a little bit about what a patristic scholar might be doing in that context. So to introduce our project, I am currently lucky to be part of an Academy of Finland funded project called At the Frontiers of Humanity, Extreme Necessity in the History of Ethics, Law and Politics, 300 to 1600, which will run up to the year 2024, potentially a little bit later. And this is a project funded by the Academy of Finland, which is maybe quite simply the Finnish Research Council that mysteriously every year chooses which projects to fund, and sometimes we are the lucky ones who get some funding. And this time, the lucky one, of course, was especially our PI, Virpi Mäkinen, who is a medievalist, works especially on legal history, medieval ethics, medieval Christian ethics, things like that, has written a lot about poverty, rights, history of rights, and so on. So she leads us in this project, and we have a team where we have some people who work also on medieval topics, Ritva Palmen and Mikko Posti. And then Heikki Haara is more like, comes from the perspective of political history and working on early modern texts mainly. And then more recently, we have been joined by Mia Korpiola and Katja Tikka, who are working on especially the Nordic history of like Nordic legislation and the Nordic intellectual history, looking at those questions then in the medieval and early modern context. And simply what we're trying to do in some way, all of us from our unique perspectives, myself, of course, then from the late antique perspective, is that we examine the interpretations and impact of the maxim of extreme necessity, which quite simply is this idea that necessity knows no law in Western intellectual history from late antiquity to the early modern period. And also we maybe perhaps try to bring some attention and light to the history of the right of subsistence, which is perhaps one of these rights that is not always even so central to like sort of modern rights discourse. And Virpi Mäkinen very much personally holds that these rights are often, while like the conception of right, or the concept of rights has much deeper roots than sometimes is presented in these sort of historical accounts of, for example, human rights in the Western tradition. So this is where we come from and where our project comes from. And as regards this maxim of extreme necessity, necessity knows no law. Usually there have been some sort of historical accounts written about where it first appears and how it develops. And quite often sort of the earliest concrete reference is traced back to the so-called Decretum Gratiani, an early law compilation or collection of canon law from the 12th century, where there is this Latin phrase, via enim necessitas non habet legens et ipsa sibi facit legem. So for necessity does not have law, but makes itself a law, or itself becomes the law. This is the idea. So if you're, for example, in a situation where you are starving and your neighbor happens to have a nice flourishing garden, then under this principle of extreme necessity, you are, for example, allowed to help yourself to whatever grows in your neighbor's garden to secure your existence, while in in a different situation that of course might be conceived as stealing, but then in a way a different law is established when your own life is at stake. And the context where this might apply are of course much broader. My colleagues look at also discussions about like legitimate violence, just war, these sorts of questions of self-defense broadly taken. And I personally have been looking a lot at just patristic accounts of poverty, sort of not so much from the legal perspective, but also a little bit from the legal perspective, and I will soon come to that a little bit more. But this idea simply is that at moments of real need and when you might otherwise die, usually die, that's maybe the criterion, then you're allowed to for example, take other people's property or defend yourself in ways that otherwise would be illegal. And usually, if you look at these sorts of accounts of how this principle came to be, patristic sources are cited, but quite often they are not the main focus or the main interest of the person writing these overviews. Typically what is then identified there is the idea that, which is of course very prevalent, for example, in Basil of Caesarea, Ambrose, this idea that somehow the fruits of nature are shared property, and therefore the poor in some ways are entitled to have their share. So this is often the patristic part that is cited, and absolutely is relevant to this discussion, but I hope to also then look at some other types of sources or other types of scenarios and intellectual inputs that might arise from the patristic period. And I'm telling you next a little bit about, yes, exactly my connection now to the previous paper, why all this is rather difficult, or why patristic background maybe is not so prominent when we look at these previous accounts of extreme necessity. I have actually now not used many of the technical terms here. Many of them were actually introduced by the previous speaker. Questions of, for example, proairesis or ta ephemin, these sorts of phrases that denote these things in ancient ethics, but I have tried to just sort of explain quite simply and not theoretically what is at stake here, and what makes this whole idea that somehow dire external circumstances allow you to make very different moral choices quite difficult in the ancient context. And having now heard this previous paper, I'm sure this does not come as a surprise. But of course, first of all, one of the big difficulties there is that, especially as this maxim of extreme necessity develops, it takes on this it becomes more and more conceived as a right that an individual holds rather than a duty that other people have towards the individual. And if you look at patristic accounts, for example, of social ethics, of course, the emphasis there is quite heavily on duties. Some scholars have said that we can see seeds of human rights there, but sort of broadly speaking, the focus is not on what the individual is entitled to do, but what duties other people have to people in their own communities or even beyond their own communities. And then, as we heard in the previous paper, in a much more sort of theoretical framework, free will or free choice, freedom of choice is very much seen as the foundation of moral agency and responsibility. So this idea that somehow being constrained by external factors in a way that deeply affects your moral decision-making, that's seen as very problematic by at least most early Christian authors, and also many other ancient authors, as we heard. And generally, if we look at the sort of ideal ancient moral agent, it's normally a he, or very often a he, and he is strong, self-sufficient, rational, this sort of person who is able to make the good choice regardless of whatever might be happening around him, and resist temptation, resist poverty, resist anything at all, and just focus on those things that are virtuous and that are truly up to his own act of will, maybe, and of course in collaboration with some divine input possibly, but anyway, sort of depend on him and his will and his act of choosing. And generally speaking, in the imperial period, there's a very broad support for the idea that these external goods do not matter for moral agency and the attainment of the good life. So what matters for moral agency is, as we heard, those things that are up to our choice, mainly virtue. And if a person is virtuous, then by implication, he or she can always choose what is good, regardless of these external circumstances. And if we sort of take this to an extreme conclusion, then I guess one conclusion could be that suffering and death are better than vice. So if one finds oneself in a situation where one's life is threatened, then the solution is not to sort of take the justice into your own hands or bend the law or establish a new law sort of in the spirit of extreme necessity, but to sort of submit to sort of accept the external and then focus on the inner reward, the inner choice. And then, of course, in the Christian framework, focus on the life to come. So of course, the idea that death is not final then informs especially the Christian thinking on what this might mean and why suffering and death are clearly preferable to bending the law in those cases. And the reason why I sort of asked my question was that, of course, this can then lead to consequences that some might find also a little bit unpastoral, out of tune with people's realities. I guess, especially these days, we are quite aware that, for example, the way that the practical surroundings in which children are brought up, things that happen to them intimately affect their ability to make moral decisions, for example. And there's definitely tension then between those sorts of observations and this idea that, in fact, external goods are not at all important for moral decision making. And then, as we heard, finally, this idea that necessity is not simply this external constraint, but it's a huge metaphysical topic, a huge question of free will, origin of evil, a number of things, like a whole metaphysical universe in a way opens up when we discuss these topics. And the idea again that our existence would be in some ways limited by necessity becomes very difficult to hold for many early Christian thinkers, who then write also polemics against determinism and fatalism, as we heard, for example, in Gregory of Nyssa's Against Fate. That's what would be one example of where this is very, very obvious. Well, all this being said, and absolutely true, one venue, though, where we then find these discussions, where we find fragile and vulnerable individuals, unpredictable life, and moral dilemmas, where it's not actually quite so clear how an individual is meant to act and what they are meant to choose, is the realm of Greco-Roman tragedy. This is something that, for example, Martha Nussbaum has much highlighted in her Fragility of Goodness and other works. And more recently, Paul Blauer's patristic scholar has written about tragedy and patristics, or how we can sort of read patristic sources within the framework of Greco-Roman tragedy, and what we can mine by using that as a lens. And in other words, people are trying to now say, both in the realm of philosophy and classics, but also in the realm of patristics, that perhaps this, while all true, is not quite as clear-cut. This idea that ancient philosophy, ancient literary tradition, patristics just glosses over the realities of human suffering, is perhaps a simplification. And this is certainly something that then has given me some food for thought, and also pushed me to look for perhaps other types of examples where we can actually see the patristic awareness of how external circumstances may be quite, may play a role in the unpredictable difficulties that an individual might encounter. So I'm in no way trying to discount the theoretical framework of the free will, all these problems that come with the disregard for the external goods, but I'm saying there are also perhaps moments of patristic sensitivity also to these difficulties that might arise. And to sort of, right, oh yeah, here I have actually, I can come back to this, but I can give you one instance of where I can see something like this at play. I have not now provided you the text, but I have sort of been trying to look like, are there patristic texts that would in some ways portray individuals that are in fact in situations where the external circumstances are such that their moral decision-making becomes very difficult or far from straightforward. And one text where I have found examples, and not the only one, but one that I'm looking at the moment, is Ambrose of Milan. His text on De Nabute, which is on Naboth, I guess in English, one of the most famous early Christian homilies on poverty and wealth, and perhaps especially against greed, builds on the biblical story of Naboth, but then includes an anecdote of a poor man who is forced by circumstances to select and sell one of his sons into slavery in order to ensure the survival of his family. So this is kind of the scene that is being set. There is this man who, in order to provide for his family due to his extreme poverty, is put in a situation where he has to deliberate selling one of his sons into slavery. And Ambrose then presents this account as something he has seen. To be fair, similar account appears also in Basil of Caesarea's homily, Destrum Horea Mea, some sort of parallel account, a little bit less different concepts being at play, but also the same vocabulary of necessity and essentially the same type of scenario. And Ambrose, of course, in this homily about poverty, presents this man, I'm not sure if I can say in a sympathetic light, but certainly somehow, of course, conveys to us that this is a very difficult situation to be in, and it is far from unclear what this man should do. Should he sell one of his sons into slavery, or should he see his whole family perish due to lack of food? And this is sort of the starting point. And then this man goes on to give a speech in which he expresses his miserable situation, deliberates about what to do, which son to sacrifice, how to sort of reconcile the paternal love and feeling with this horrible necessity that is now tearing the family apart, and so on. And it has been recognized in previous research that this passage is highly rhetorical, of course, but very little has been said in like what way is it rhetorical. I think it's quite common, or has been especially common, that when something is rhetoric, then we can kind of pass by and focus on the substance, so to speak. And this, of course, is something that is now changing both in the realm of classics and also in patristics, that we start to understand that there is a lot to examine and mine also in these rhetorical passages that may actually convey something more than just flourish to us. And Blowers, whom I mentioned earlier, actually links Basil's story of the same situation to the genre of Greco-Roman tragedy, saying that can be used as a lens to this to look at this sort of miserable scene of decision making where necessity constraints and no good outcomes are seemingly possible. And that's certainly, I think, a useful way to look at this. And then what I am now doing in my paper, which I'm not presenting in so much detail, but perhaps if we meet again, I can, or if we meet at a different conference, perhaps you will hear more about my findings. But I have now chosen to approach this account from the perspective of Roman legal rhetoric, having read about this and having read about some other similar cases. I have sort of come to conclude that this whole topic of sacrificing your child, deliberating with the person is guilty, having this sort of very unclear boundaries about what is right, what is wrong. This is the sort of discourse that in fact finds a lot of parallels in what is called declamations, the Roman legal rhetorical tradition. And this idea that necessity is constraining you, perhaps making you less guilty of certain acts. This is all very much at home there. If we read Cicero, for example, on how he advises to go about investigating someone's culpability in the realm of legal rhetoric. Of course, the question of necessity, whether it was your free choice or whether you were forced to do it, becomes very, very important. But I personally argue that where we should go here is not sort of the realm of strict law as such, but this legal rhetoric, where these sort of slightly bizarre, very elaborate cases of family tragedies, conflicts flourish, and where you often see these cases where, for example, necessity and piety, which in the Latin context is this sort of family feeling, the feeling of parents towards their children and children towards their parents, and all the duties that sort of arise from that. Where that is juxtaposed with the sort of necessity that then tears these family units apart. So I'm sort of now to maybe conclude or say where I'm going with this research is that I'm trying to take into account, of course, the theoretical background, the difficulties, the cosmological, metaphysical difficulties of necessity, but then also look at these sort of more applied scenarios where things seem less clear-cut and try to find some Greco-Roman parallels to that might further inform us on how to approach the topic of necessity, and especially this idea that necessity might truly compromise moral decision making, in a good way. And then if I sort of just kind of conclude, I will say that I'm especially interested if necessity in these cases is just something that is a mitigating factor because you are not actually a full moral agent, or if there are hints somewhere that it might establish entirely new norms or laws in the same way as the sort of the maxim of extreme necessity as an individual right then comes to be. And I will perhaps conclude just by saying that if you can think of any relevant passages, especially of this sort of practical nature, where scenarios are described that might be very unideal for the poor decision maker, please email them to me. There's my email address. I'm very curious about this, and of course I will acknowledge your contribution appropriately in my publication. But I think this is actually where I want to stop before I ramble too much, because I don't have set notes or nicely written paper. So just to conclude here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Siiri. It was a wonderful presentation. Thank you for introducing us to your project. And I think we are very happy that the Finnish Academy chose to support your project. It's really fascinating. Now it's time for questions. I wonder if we have questions. Please raise your hands. I think at this moment you can just one second. I need to write any question from the group. Yeah, I see it's Father Oleh. Please, Father Oleh.
One passage that I'm thinking of, I apologize that I'm again coming from my little parish of Clement of Alexandria. There's this exhortation of Clement to the rich people who go out of the gathering. I can send you the passage. And when you see the people, extending their hands for help in that extreme poverty, don't turn your face away, he says, because those people are also, carrying the image of God. They are representing Christ. I always come through that passage, and I have my chills. It's always a picture or a situation with different faces or different aspects. There are those who are in necessity and those who are able to help. So there is Ananke and there is Eleusis. There's always, something coming out of blue. So I appreciate your paper very much. I'm trying to put down your email to keep in touch with you. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm very glad that there is already a fruit of our cooperation and exchange of thoughts and emails. Good, thank you. Maria, please.
Thank you, Siiri, for your wonderful presentation. And I have maybe not a question, but maybe some reflection on your presentation, because I read a Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski, and in one of his essays, he told that there are some cases when there is no good decision. Like there is a situation when, usually we treat like good decision if we in Aristotelian terms, when there is like two extremes and we choose something in between. But there are situations that whatever we choose, somebody will be harmed. And I was thinking about the situation in modern times, especially in the countries of global south, when there are, for instance, some mines, where young children are working, and very often the products of these mines or some industries, they are consumed by global north, and I was thinking about the structures of evil that sometimes make those poor people to choose from like very bad starting points. So they have no choice, for instance, than to send their children not to school but to work, because otherwise they will not have anything to eat. But on the other hand, the people who are responsible for the problem are not recognizing their moral responsibility for this. So for me, it's interesting to see, like, also from this social teaching of the church perspective, how we can deal with the problem of this extreme necessity, that we can help those people to not to have to choose from the extreme necessity.
Thank you so much for that comment. And I think that, I mean, of course, in these patristic sources also, if we, for example, look at this passage that comes from Ambrose, like obviously then the gaze is turned at like the rich bystander, and that's kind of the true guilty party. So that's obviously where he's also driving. And I very much agree with you that there are like troubling examples that arise also from contemporary situations. And of course, as a patristic scholar, then I ask, like, is this patristic tradition like relevant to those questions, or have they simply completely ignored whole realms of human experience and in this case suffering? So thank you very much for your contribution. I think these are really important questions to ponder. Yeah.
And thank you, Siiri, for your presentation and for your answers. I think we need to give a round of applause to Siiri. Thank you.
Thank you.
And it's a very natural passage for us to Maria's presentation, our next speaker. Maria, she's a secretary of the Ukrainian Patristic Society, and she teaches at the Ukrainian Catholic University. It seems to be that the Ukrainian Catholic University is really a kind of power plant for patristic studies in Ukraine. Maria's presentation will bring us from the pre-Nicene, ante-Nicene period to post-Nicene period, from Origen to Maximus the Confessor, the main figure in the Eastern patristics at least. So Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Father Cyril. I will start my presentation. Everybody can see my presentation?
If you could put on, please, the presentation mode.
One moment.
It's on the bottom. If you go to the bottom, and you will find this like a screen icon.
One second. Is it?
We can see it like as kind of edit mode. If you could put on the presentation
okay.
mode.
One moment.
Yeah, slideshow.
Okay, perfect.
Very good, excellent.
One moment. I need my paper as well. Okay, maybe I will present orally.
No, you can actually, you can also leave it in the edit mode. It's all right if it's easy for you.
Okay. So my presentation is about Maximus' opponents, my field of research is Maximus the Confessor, his theology of movement, his concept of movement as it's I'm sorry. So this is a part of my dissertation in which I explore the theological concept of movement in Maximus the Confessor, and mainly its ontological foundation. In his works, Maximus insists on the radical otherness of creation in respect to God, and between God and beings lies an ontological abyss. So while God exists beyond time and motion, the world is historical. It originated in time and moves towards communion with God in form of theosis. In part, man is responsible for encountering God and bringing all creation to its eschatological goal through his own spiritual progress. And while studying this topic, I noticed that Maximus develops his ontology in the context of his refutation of Origenism. But this case is quite interesting because the nature of this Origenism is still not clearly defined, because as well as the precise reason why Maximus utilizes it to present his own ideas. On one hand, we know that Maximus borrowed a lot from some authors who were traditionally called Origenists, such as Evagrius Ponticus. On the other hand, he is strongly against Origen's idea of primordial henot of spiritual beings and their prehistoric downfall. So this topic is actually on the border between two of my research topics. First one is Maximus himself, and the second one is together with Father Oleh Kindiy, translation of Evagrius Ponticus Practicos and Gnosticos, the small treatises that are connected with his very famous and quite controversial Gnostic chapters, which I will mention several times here. So while I was studying the way that Evagrius's works were disseminated and also cancelled in a way because of his ideas, because of some borrowings from Origen that he developed into his own philosophy, and it was not well received in Greek tradition, in the Byzantine tradition. So this is like an interesting way to present also how Maximus encountered this tradition of Evagrius and how he transformed it. But today I will talk specifically about the Origenism after Evagrius, and specifically Origenism in Palestine and also in Syria, that could be possibly an interlocutor for Maximus for him to present better his own ontology. So we can say that the Origenism as a term is quite complicated. It's quite vague because very numerous doctrines were labeled as Origenist from the 4th century to the times of Maximus and beyond, because we know that there is a so-called first Origenist controversy in the 4th century Egypt, and later there is a second Origenist controversy in the 5th and 6th centuries that originated in Sabaeid monasteries in Palestine. And this latter Origenism is difficult to outline dogmatically. And Brian Daly said that, quote, Origenist monks of Palestine as current in the church represented a much wider range of theological views that their name might suggest. What they had in common was an interest in intellectual exercise and theological speculation, which is probably manifested in the Origenist approach to theology rather than any particular doctrinal system. And as Origenism spread in Syria, it also merged with some different theological movements that were alternative to the Chalcedonian Orthodoxy. So at the time when Maximus wrote his famous Ambiguum 7, this is one of the treatises that he wrote to John of Cyzicus, his teacher. In the 7th century, Origenism was already quite a marginal trend, at least in Byzantium. And instead it gained some spread in Syria, especially in the monophysite environment. So it's interesting to see why would Maximus need to return to consideration and condemnation of this doctrine, although it's already lost its popularity. And so far, Maximus scholars did not pay so much attention to singling out some specific opponents of Maximus in this regard. It seems that at the core of the theological debates about who started Origenism as a movement lies the Origen versus Evagrius confrontation. So scholars do not have a consensus about Origen's heresy and the justice of accusations against him. For example, Henri Crouzel believes that accusations of Origen in heresy are groundless, and the so-called Origenism is the erroneous interpretation of his teachings by his followers, such as Evagrius, and also later interpreters. Antoine Guillemot demonstrated that the Fifth Ecumenical Council based its understanding of Origen's teachings on the basis of the Gnostic chapters of Evagrius Ponticus. Still, Evagrius obviously did not intentionally distort Origen's teaching, but these teachings could well have been distorted also by their opponents who won the argument. And the exact definition of Origenism is also quite vague. Some interpret it very broadly, identifying it as, in general, borrowing by Christian mystical authors of the main elements of Neoplatonic cosmology, such as the concept of proodos, epistrophe, apokatastasis, etc. Of course, Origen's teachings cannot be seen as unproblematic, but between Origen and Maximus lie centuries of development, so it's important to figure out in what form it reached Maximus. So among the possible contenders for the discussion between them and Maximus, we can distinguish monophysite Origenists, monothelite Origenists, Syrian author Stefan Barsudaili, and also North African Origenists, according to different theories that were proposed by the scholars. So our search for Maximus' opponents will begin with the Second Origenist controversy, which took place in the monasteries of Saint Sabas. Bypassing the circumstances of the dispute, we will turn to Leontius of Byzantium, who, according to the testimony of Cyril of Scythopolis, was one of the key figures of this movement. Cyril counts him among the heresiarchs, along with Nonnus, Theodore Ascedas, and Domitian. And the Origenism of the 5th and 6th centuries drew inspiration not from Origen himself, but from Evagrius. Their core belief was that minds, or noes logikoi, freely depart from God. They are put in different bodies depending on the degree of their fall, and the only mind that did not fall away was Christ, and therefore he was chosen to unite with the Logos, the Son of God, and restore souls to their original incorporeal state and this unity that they fell off. So Guillemot states that the Council of the Fifth Ecumenical Council anathematisms against Origen were almost direct quotations from Gnostic chapters, despite the fact that Evagrius himself was not condemned. And David Evans tried to prove that Leontius was indeed an Evagrian, and that in his defense of Chalcedonian theology, as we know him for, he was like disguising his Origenism, and primarily his subject of attack was metaphysics and anthropology of Leontius. The same John Meyendorff tries to show that there were some elements of this Evagrian Christology, pointing out that Leontius seems to believe in pre-existence of God, of Christ as a mind before incarnation. On the other hand, Daniel Hombergen states that there is insufficient evidence for such accusations, and Leontius rather critically mentions Origen rather from a critical standpoint, and he clearly articulates his pro-Chalcedonian position and criticizes both the monophysites and the followers of Theodore of Mopsuestia. He rather opposes these ideas that we mentioned as Evagrian on several points. He states that the world was created ex nihilo, so from nothing, that the soul does not pre-exist the body, but it comes into existence together with it, and that the fall was not carried out by an disembodied spirit, but by a corporeal man. So no pre-existence of souls. He believed in the punishment of sinners and the final resurrection. He also distinguished between the unity of man with God by grace and the essential unity of the two natures in Christ. So this fact contrasts sharply with the description given to Leontius by Cyril of Scythopolis. And to complicate the deal, the identity of Leontius, the Origenist, from the life of Saint Sabas by Cyril of Scythopolis, and the Leontius that was the author of the corpus of works attributed to him is proven. And according to Daniel Hombergen, this testifies not only to an arbitrary interpretation and distortion of history, but also to the fact that the true reason for this conflict was something other than Origenism. In particular, he believes that researchers paid too little attention to the connection between the condemnation of the three chapters and the Origenists at the Fifth Ecumenical Council. And after breaking out in one of the Sabaeid monasteries, the Origenist movement split into two currents: the Isochrists, who were more committed to this Evagrian heritage, and the Protoctists, who rejected the Christology of Evagrius and left only the Origenian myth and transformed it into the doctrine of the first creation. The latter believed that at first the mental world separated from God and was created, and only then the material world came to be. So they became so-called Origenists without origin, and they continued to exist in such state till the 8th century. So next, the ideas of the Origenists, they received a certain reception in Syria, both in a monophysite and so-called Nestorian circles, although in different ways. According to Guillemot, monophysitism shared the Alexandrian tradition as a common root with Origenism and was partially influenced by Neoplatonism. And therefore they had a common enemy, Theodore of Mopsuestia, and the Nestorian tradition. According to Hombergen, this explains the struggle of Theodore Asidas against the three chapters. So according to Guillaume, he was an outspoken monophysite. At the same time, the monophysites formally renounced Origenism, as it became one of the labels that they used against their opponents. On the other hand, Nestorians, in particular Baba the Great, called the pro-Chalcedonian party Theopaschites, and indirectly also accused them of the blasphemy of Origen, specifically the doctrine of the pre-existence of souls and an idea about some ethereal spherical body of Christ after resurrection. And despite their contempt for Origen, they very much respected Evagrius Ponticus. Since it was Palestine and Syria that proved most receptive to Origen's ideas through Evagrius, and the uncensored Syriac version of his Gnostic chapters, because there were two versions of translations of the Gnostic chapters. The censored one, which presents more more orthodox view of his philosophy, and uncensored one, which influenced spread the ideas of Evagrius in Syria. And perhaps here is the place where Maximus' direct opponents could be sought. Moreover, we can see it from the Syrian version of Life of Maximus, which is currently considered more reliable than the Greek one, regarding the origins of Maximus and his life before his struggle with monothelitism, although it's very biased towards Maximus himself. And according to this life, Maximus was of Palestinian origin, and he became a pupil of Abba Pantolius from the Cariton Lavra. And Abba Pantolius in the life of Maximus is described as Origenist. And if it's true, then Maximus came to know about Origenism quite early. And according to Alexis Stryger, Maximus could have familiarized himself with the work of Origenists in the library of the Lavra. And also we can see this from the 9th century homily of the Melkite preacher, Michael of Mark Hariton, who addresses this homily to the sages in Gnosis and simple monks. So we can see that in the Cariton Lavra was also this division between very intellectualist monks and more like monks who preferred praxis over intellectualism. This is a common pattern you can see in Sabayit monasteries, where there was this controversy around Origenism, that there were also monks who preferred theological studies, philosophical studies, and they were in opposition with Sabbas, who preferred he preferred that they would just pray and practice asceticism instead of developing different strange ideas. And also we can see this pattern in the first controversy as well, where there were so-called tall monks, so the circle of Evagrius Ponticus, and also the monks that were illiterate very often. And there was this accusation that these illiterate monks, they had very anthropomorphic vision of God, and instead the intellectual monks were labeled as like pejoratively tall monks. So however, it's quite hard to establish the identity of Maximus' opponents accurately. We can see in this region a various number of competing groups and currents. There were different monophysites groups: Antiochian Chalcedonians, Neo-Chalcedonians, Nestorians, Monophyletic Maronites, etc. And many of these schools could be tentatively labeled as Christian Neoplatonisms or Origenists. Basil Lourier believes that Maximus was dealing with the Syrian monoenergist Origenism, namely with its Protoctist branch, as I mentioned, this more latent Origenists. And there was also this, during this discussion, during this controversy between monoenergists and duotelates, there were like accusation of each other in this Origenism, and these monothelites, they accused their opponents in the fact that in Christ, they believed that in Christ there were two wills that are not God's will and human will, but rather bodily will and spiritual will. So you can see here also this, they accused the duotelates of what they believed to be true, actually. So this is about monothelites, and another possible interlocutor for Maximus is Syrian Origenist Stephan Bar Sudaili. He was a mystic of 6th century and a probable author of the book of Hierotheus, and also he commented on Dionysius the Areopagite, and he's considered a vivid representative of Syrian Neoplatonism. By Antoine Guillemot, he is attributed Origenism in an extreme and even occult form. We find information about Stephan Bar Sudaili in the testimony of Philoxenus of Mabuk, who was his opponent, but was probably himself a moderate Origenist. In particular, Philoxenus is considered the author of this more censored version of the Gnostic chapters. So Stephan Bar Sudaili's views are also evidenced by Jacob of Serug, in which he warns Stephan in his letter against believing in the limited period of punishment for sinners after death. So he warned Stephan against the apokatastasis. And according to Philoxenus, Stephan develops a systematic doctrine of time, according to which 3 periods can be distinguished: the 6th day, the 7th, and the 1st day of creation. The present day, in which the material world was directly created and which is characterized by movement, represents the 6th day of creation, and Stephan equates this movement with freedom and also evil. Then there is going to be a period of rest, or a mental Sabbath, in which all people will receive equal recompense. And after everyone has reached this purity, after this Sabbath, there will be the 1st day, or Sunday, when everything will return to the original unity with God, when God will be all in all and everything will be consubstantial to God. So his philosophical system was quite monistic and extremely strongly conditioned by its Neoplatonic foundation. So considering the fact that his Neoplatonism is so extreme and obvious, it's doubtful that it is Stephan's doctrine that Maximus refutes in the Ambigua, since those appear to be much more subtle than his. So, and finally, the last version about who could be this interlocutor belongs to Julia Konstantinovsky, who believes that Maximus fought against North African Origenists, probably because the Ambigua were written between 628 and 630, shortly after Maximus settled in North Africa. But Father Maximus Constas points out that Maximus developed most of his ideas expressed in the Ambigua 2 years before, while he was communicating with John of Cyzicus, whose monastery was in Asia Minor, and Maximus discussed his ideas with him during he spent time in that monastery. And later, John asked Maximus to send a written version of these reflections. So we can see that we cannot accept this idea about North African Origenists. And all things considered, my opinion that in his reputation of Origenism, Maximus could have opposed the monothelites, who utilized the texts of Gregory of Nazianzus and Dionysius the Areopagite to ground their claims and prove their the perceived patristic origins of their monothelitism. And since both monothelitism and Origenism share the Neoplatonic inspiration, there are possible allies. And the theological synthesis of Maximus itself gives us some clues, since his Christology is very tightly connected with his ontology, and therefore both of these doctrines could be a useful tool also for him to express his ideas in contrast to them. So this is in general what I wanted to present, and thank you for attention.
Thank you so much, Maria, for your presentation. And now it's time for questions. Who has a question? No. Right. So if there are no questions, then we may pass to another speaker. Thank you, Maria, for your presentation. I think you deserve a good round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Harry, would you like to introduce the next speaker, Tomi?
Thank you, Professor. The next speaker is an up-and-coming patristic scholar from Finland, namely, more specifically from the University of Helsinki. He is a multi-talent man. He is going to receive a degree in ancient Greek very shortly, and he is translating Saint Athanasius of Alexandria's work, which will be published in Finnish very shortly by the Finnish Patristic Society. And in this presentation, he will be telling us about his work on his PhD project, which is just about to start at the University of Helsinki, and he has just been awarded a 2-year full grant by the Finnish Cultural Foundation, which is a huge thing in Finland. So congratulations. Here we have Tomi Ferm. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. Now I share my screen. Yes, you can. Can you see it now? Yes. So, hello everyone. I am honored to be invited in this online conference to celebrate the friendship of Finns and Ukrainians and to show what is going on in the field of patristics in our countries. I am the youngest speaker here in academic career, so I feel privileged to be presenting among these great scholars. As was said, I'm a doctoral researcher in the University of Helsinki, and the title of my presentation is the topic of my dissertation, I started this project last autumn, and as was publicly announced yesterday, and as Harri said, I have now received a 2-year funding from Suomen Kulttuurirahasto, the Finnish Cultural Foundation, to my research project. I have not gotten very far in my dissertation yet, as it has been only half year, and I have been finishing some other projects same time. Namely a translation of Athanasius' letters to Serafim from Greek to Finnish, which is about to be published by Societas Patristica Fennica. The title presented here may still change. An article about the natures of God and creation in Athanasius' Theology in Finnish, which is currently in peer reviewing, and my second master's thesis from the field of classics about daemonic souls in Theology and Theology of Proclus of Athens. So today I am presenting you mainly the idea and outline of my dissertation. As Georges Florovsky wrote in his article, The Concept of Creation in Athanasius, there was, in the vision of Saint Athanasius, an ultimate and radical cleavage, or hiatus, between the absolute being of God and the contingent existence of the world. There were actually two modes of existence, radically different and totally dissimilar. In my dissertation, I'm going to dive deep into the second mode of being, to the contingent world or cosmos, to its theological and philosophical basis, and to its meaning for Athanasius' wider theological thinking. Creation is extremely important for Athanasius and for his legacy to later theology, for he was one of the first Christian thinkers to appreciate the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo fully, as Alvin Pettersen has written. And as Khaled Anatolios has shown in his book, Athanasius, the Coherence of his Thought, Athanasius' theology is based on relation of opposites, mainly the opposites of creator and creation, and the opposite of God and human. And his goal is to teach how God, the Logos, crossed the ontological gulf of creator and creation by taking a human body or becoming a man, so that us humans might become gods, as he writes in his De Incarnatione Verbi Dei. In my dissertation, I'm going to give special emphasis to angels and the whole invisible cosmos. Angels and demons were very important for theologies, philosophies, and the whole religious landscape in late antiquity, but they are studied too little. Athanasius did not write theological treatises about angels or demons, but they play a major role in his works and argumentation. We all know about demons in Life of Anthony, but angels were also important in his dogmatic works. In his anti-Arian works, he argues time and time again why Logos is not one of many logoi and a kind of archangel, as Philo taught, or one power among many powers, like Asterius the Sophist wrote in his Syntagmation. Letters to Serapion, in turn, were written against Tropici, who taught that Holy Ghost was one of angels and not God by nature like Father and Son. Angels are important, as they are among created beings, those that are by properties closest to God, and they are gods by the grace of God, but by nature they are still creatures and thus from nothing. Angels also offer interesting parallels to humans, as they are intelligent beings who are able to fall in sin like us humans. There has been much discussion among Athanasian scholars about Athanasius' knowledge of philosophy and use of it in his theology. This has formed two paradigms among scholars. Up until 1960s, it was communis opinio among Athanasian scholars that Athanasius was an anti-philosophical theologian interested mainly in soteriology, and he used philosophical arguments rarely and eclectically when it suited his theological purpose. According to this paradigm, Athanasius was mainly a biblical theologian. From 1960s onwards, more and more scholars started seeing Athanasius as a Platonic thinker, especially through Eginhard Meyering's study Orthodoxy and Platonism in Athanasius' Synthesis or Antithesis, where he made a case that Athanasius had thorough knowledge of Platonic thinking and not of any other schools, and he actively tried to create synthesis of Christianity and Platonism. J.N.D. Kelly, for example, has even written in his early Christian doctrines that there is little doubt that Athanasius's Platonism tended at times to lose touch with his Christianity, which is of course a widely criticized statement. Myself, I tend to go somewhere middle. I'm quite convinced of Khaled Anatolios' model where he combines these two paradigms, meaning that interlocking ontological, soteriological, and historical perspectives provide a key to coherence of Athanasius' theology. Clear Platonic elements are used in handling of opposites of creator and creation, which is foundational for Athanasius' theology and historical dimension of Christian faith. As I argue in my aforementioned article about the natures of God and creation too, the categories Athanasius uses to distinct two modes of existence are deeply rooted in philosophical tradition. The categories I have picked from Athanasius' writings and former studies are createdness, ability to create, everything versus nothing, being versus becoming, participation, active versus passive, time, change, oneness or uniqueness, simplicity, space, body and matter, and impassibility, meaning that only God can create, and cosmos is an act of creation. And as a creation is ex nihilo, God is the only principle of everything, and cosmos is by nature nothing. God is true being, and cosmos comes to exist by participating to the existence of God, who does not participate but is participated. God is active principle, whereas cosmos is by nature passive and object of his hegemonia. God is timeless and creator of time, whereas creatures are contingent, having by nature beginning and end to their existence. There is no change in God, but creatures are by nature constantly changing. God is one and only, whereas creatures are ones of many. God is simple, he is hen eidos, one form. There is nothing around him, and everything in him is substantial, whereas creatures are made of parts, and they have accidental features. God is everywhere and non-spatial, but creatures are in space. God is bodiless and immaterial, whereas creatures have material bodies. Bodies are passible, but God, as immaterial, is impassible. Important notion here is that everything on the creation side is something linked with pre-existent matter in philosophical traditions. Of course, Athanasius' matter is once created from nothing, and so the nothingness and creation's existence in time are more radical than in non-Christian philosophical traditions. Nevertheless, this means that nature of cosmos, the nature of second mode of being, is basically the nature of matter, and every existent thing that is not by nature the God himself is a material body with all the features affiliated with bodies. This emphasis of materiality of the second mode of existence goes well in hand with Alvin Pettersen's and Khaled Anatolios' observation that Athanasius tends to read our humanity rather to our body than to our soul. But this line of thinking about cosmos tends to pull Athanasius more towards Stoicism, for it would mean that human souls must be material too. Also, universals do not seem to have place in his system as existent things, for it would mean that they must be either bodies or God himself. Thus, they seem to be more like Stoic universals than Platonic ones, God's thoughts, how to organize and rule cosmos, that do not really exist as a things themselves. In Contra Gentes, Athanasius uses Stoic language also to describe God's immanent impact on cosmos and his harmonious and providential care over it. He even compares the relation of logos and cosmos to the relation of soul and body, which draws him very near to Stoic pantheism, but then he denies it by saying that logos is not Stoic seminal logos, and after it he shifts to Platonic discourse. I still feel that we should read what Athanasius actually says, because some use it as if Athanasius was denying Stoic logos spermatikoi altogether. By word, I do not mean the word involved and innate in every creature, which some are accustomed to call seminal. It has no life of its own, neither can it reason or think, but it acts merely by an extrinsic art according to the skill of him who set it in the creature. Nor do I mean the word of humankind, which is composed of syllables and expressed in the air, but I mean the living and acting God, the very word of the good God of the universe, who is other than created things and all creation. He is rather the sole and individual word of the good Father, who has ordered all this universe and illuminates it by his providence. So what Athanasius is doing here is not denying logos spermatikoi, but affirming them. God is not pantheistic bodily God that is spread all over universe, and these logoi are not seminal parts of him that move universe, but he is other than cosmos, its creator, who set these logoi, the innate logic of their function, to every created being. Neither in Stoicism is a seminal logos a thing itself, but a local function of the logos, the reason of all-reaching pneumatic God or world soul. But for Athanasius, the seminal logoi are manifestations of the will of transcendent logos in the cosmos. So what I'm saying, that even though Athanasius perceives God's transcendent being and essence, the first mode of existence, philosophically mostly in Platonic terms, the second mode of being, the cosmos, is ordered mostly in Stoic terms. For the relation of these two modes of existence, Athanasius uses tools of both traditions. So Athanasius is not anti-philosophical thinker, even though he is sometimes skeptical about capabilities of philosophy, which is itself a trend in philosophy, but neither is he a Platonist. He is also not a Stoic philosopher, but a Christian one. Philosophy schools were both intellectual and religious competitors to Christianity, and Athanasius uses their ideas eclectically to teach and defend Christianity. This is the line of thinking from where I'm approaching the topic, and much of this is more thoroughly argued in my article, which is currently on peer review, and it will be more refined in my dissertation, mainly in chapter 3, where I'm going to discuss about meaning of creation for Athanasius' theology and its theological and philosophical basis. And in chapter 4, where I'm going to draw a picture how Athanasius sees the world and all the creatures in it, especially angels and heavenly part of it. According to Athanasius, we can infer things about invisible cosmos from visible cosmos. And for example, the angelic orders seem to be for him similar species in the invisible cosmos as animal species are in the visible. In the following chapters, I'm going to apply the results to the discussion of Athanasius' anthropology, soteriology, and deification. So the dissertation has two main parts. The one where I analyze the creation, cosmos, and angels, where I analyze what creation, cosmos, and angels are and how they are like. And the second where I discuss about their significance for human condition. I'm still in the first part of this project, so I may only make hypotheses, but it seems to me, for example, that the Platonic theory that through Christ's salvific work there would happen a change in the form of humans must be incorrect, because there is no place for a kind of form that could go through changes in Athanasius' philosophical system. As I said before, it also seems to me that human souls must be material in Athanasius' thinking, because otherwise they could not exist as an individual thing when departing from the body in death. The comparison between angels and humans also brings perspectives to the questions about fall, salvation, and damnation. For example, why all the humans fall to sin with Adam, but all the angels do not fall with Satan and his demons. It seems to me that Athanasius' answer would be that all creation is material and humans consist of parts of their parents and thus of parts of Adam, and so they are made parts of fallen man, as he says, all the logoi of every human are created in him. Whereas angels do not have children, and so the bodies of angels in the same species are separate, and the fall of one does not affect others. Another question is, how does the divinity of the angels differ from the divinity humans gain through Christ's salvific action? On the other hand, destiny of damned humans is much linked to the destiny of demons. It seems to me that according to Athanasius, because the reasons for the fall of humans and demons are different, God does not need to offer salvation to demons as he does to humans. Neither will he do that. But he also says in the so-called fourth letter to Serapim that those who blasphemed Holy Spirit have committed an unforgivable sin, and they will burn with their father the devil in eternal flame, meaning that there is a similar damnation to some of humans that there is to demons. As a source material in my dissertation, I wish to use the whole Athanasian corpus as far as it is relevant to these topics. For example, most of Historia Arianorum, where Athanasius reports current events and tries to defend his innocence, is not relevant to the topic, but his dogmatic, ascetic, and exegetical works have much to work with. For example, Contra Gentes de Incarnatione Verbi Dei, Orationes contra Arianos de Decretis Nicene Synodi Epistulae ad Serapionem, and Epistula ad Epictetum from the theological works have lots of interesting content for the study of these topics, same as Vita Antoni of the ascetic works, and so-called fourth letter to Serapion and Expositiones in Psalmos for exegetical works. The corpus is big and there are many languages, but it is not huge. So I feel it's a manageable task because I have done much work with Athanasius's dogmatic works already. The benefits of this are clear. I can hopefully see if there are chronological changes in his thinking or if he sees things from different views in other genres. As I have said, my work is still in the beginning and there are still 3.5 years for a target time of defending my dissertation. I have presented you many lines of thought where I can grab onto and from which you will hear in the future. But this Stoic line in Athanasius' second mode of being seems to me being a topic worthwhile of digging in. A clear challenge for me is that my mind and interest tend to wander wide, so I must try to keep focus. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tomi, for a very detailed immersion to your project, to your research project. I hope we will be able to familiarize ourselves with your project in due time when it is ready. Now it's time for questions. So who has questions? Any question? I see we have Vyacheslav Litvinenko, right? Vyacheslav works on Athanasius. This is your field. Any question? And this is also an opportunity to introduce Vyacheslav to our group. He lives in Germany, right? You live in Germany now.
No, I'm in Prague right now.
Oh, in Prague, sorry, I forgot. Yeah, it's in Charles University, right. All right, so any question to Tomi? No questions, right? Then, if there are no questions, then we move to our last speaker, last presenter, Alexander Kashuk. Alexander, like the rest of our speakers, Ukrainian speakers today, he's connected with the Ukrainian Catholic University, but also with Ivan Franko Lviv University, right? Alexander, because it's this conference is like a symposium, literally, with many treats, and in the end we're going to have a beer treat. How we can how the patristic legacy can enlighten us on the attitude to such a thing as beer brewing. We left this presentation for the end as a dessert to keep people like following the discussion until the end. And I hope now we will enjoy Alexander's presentation. Alexander, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Father Cyril. Dear colleagues, the topic of my presentation is Christian standpoint towards beer brewing in late antiquity and early Middle Ages. In this presentation, I am going to bring to your attention one of the results of human interaction with nature in Christianity of late antiquity and early Middle Ages. It is about food production, specifically brewing and beer. I will begin with an introduction, then I will move on to brewing in non-Christian Europe of late antiquity. After that, I will deal with brewing in patristic and monastic tradition. Finally, I will conclude with presentation of brewing in Christianized society of Middle Ages. Let me start with an introduction in which I like to give you a bit of background. Food production is a sphere where nature, human ingenuity, and human labor come together. Accordingly, some elements of food were illustrated as universal symbols of work and welfare already in late antique and early medieval Christian world. Images of wine, oil, and bread became the symbols of human work in the Christian Roman world. It was human being who purposely planted and grew vines, olive trees, and corns to produce wine, oil, and bread. A good example of this is Saint Augustine in his Enarrationes in Psalmos, who wrote, uva pendet in vitibus et oliva in arboribus, et nec uva vinum est, nec oliva oleum ante pressuram. These symbols served as a basement for ideology of civilization according to which humans transform nature through new invention. I will expand on the point that brewing appears as one of these inventions that entered into the Roman world. Although beer is a beverage that comes from natural brewing and fermentation process, its production is unthinkable without involvement of human being and its rational adaptation to climate specificity. For it was plant cultivation that brewing directly depended on. Ancient people knew that beer was made where vines did not grow. Herodotus observed that for wine, Egyptians use a drink made of barley because they have no vines in their country. Diodorus of Sicily, an ancient Greek historian, claimed that Dionysus, the god of grape harvest, taught barbarians to produce good beer because vines did not naturally grow in their land. In this way, beer directly treated as a substitute for wine. I'd now like to move on to the brewing in non-Christian Europe. Let me elaborate on that. Brewing has its old history in Egypt. Therefore, it is not purely European invention as such, but Europeans much developed the new techniques of brewing. In Europe, beer was known to Greeks already in the 7th century before Christ. The oldest known reference which mentions beer in relation to barbarians belongs to Greek poet Archilochus from the 7th century before Christ. For him, beer is a beverage of Thracians or Phrygians. In later centuries, with expansion of the Roman Empire into the regions of Western Europe, Romans unexpectedly discovered beer in the peoples of these areas. Paisius of Massalia, a Greek geographer, knew beer in Britannia as local fermented beverage made of grain and water. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, a Greek historian, mentioned that the Gauls used for wine a liquor with unpleasant smell made from barley rotted in water. Pliny the Elder specifies that the beverage made of grain soaked in water belongs to the people of the West. The Roman historian Tacitus pointed to the beer consumption in Germanic lands. This brings me to the point on social value of beer. Beer in the eyes of Romans was of arguable social value. After Romans had come across beer in Germans and Gauls, whom they perceived as uncivilized people, the beverage appeared to be considered by Romans as barbaric. Historian Tacitus described beer as corruptus vini, that means deprivation of wine. Dionysius of Halicarnassus characterized beer as a foul-smelling liquor used for wine. Thus, these authors evaluated beer as clearly a non-Roman beverage and inferior to wine. They laid fundaments of barbarization of beer for the next centuries, which, however, did not interfere it to become popular beverage and important enough in Europe by the end of the 3rd century. The growing popularity of beer was directly proportional to the increasing sowing of corns. Let me now move on to the question of Christian attitude towards brewing. The first Christian author who alluded to beer was Sextus Iulius Africanus from the early 3rd century AD. He associated brewing with the lack of viticulture in barbarian people. Thus, he acknowledged that brewing was a human ingenuity resulting from interaction with nature. Barbarization of beer became weaker with the increasing Christianization of barbarians in West. Later patristic authors evaluated brewing in regard to its moral qualities, not in terms of its status as a manufacture of newly Christianized barbarian people. Their standpoint towards brewing evolved from scriptural exegesis of a fragment of the book of Isaiah, which has a passage that illustrates the downfall of Egypt. Among those who will be subjected to punishment, the beer makers will be grieved and will be distressed in their souls. Eusebius of Caesarea claims that ditos, that means beer, was consumed by Egyptians before Christ. It was both adulterated and made cloudy. All makers of Egyptian zitos will groan. Cyril of Alexandria perceives zitos as a cold and cloudy drink of Egyptians, which could cause incurable illness. Instead, wine was esteemed by him as good drink that, according to Psalms, gladdens man's heart. Theodoret of Cyrus slanders zitos as not a natural beverage, but manufactured. It is vinegary, foul-smelling and harmful, not like wine that brings joy to people. It seems that fathers criticized brewers as makers of a beverage that causes moral damages, but they do not classify it as a pagan or barbarian drink. Remarkable transformation of Christian attitude towards brewing came with increasing communication with Christianized barbarian peoples in the West. The centers of notable beer production became Christian monasteries that adopted culture of brewing in the areas they had Christianized. This brings me to my next point concerning monasteries and brewing. The earliest known contact of the monastic movement with the region of beer makers took place in Gaul in the 4th century. Monasteries and those of Romanized people who visited monasteries and lived in them should have also accepted beer. Accordingly, beer should have found its place among the codes of monastic discipline. The most significant monastic rule in Western Europe is the rule of Saint Benedict from the middle of the 6th century. There are a few statements concerning brewing in relation to monks' obligation of manual labor in order to provide work itself and to sustain the self-sufficiency of the monastery. Thus, brewing was indirectly accepted as a positive manufacturing. Next, I would like to illustrate the brewing was spreading all over medieval Europe. Columbanus, an Irish missionary, has made an important contribution to spreading brewing to continental Europe. He founded monasteries in the Frankish and Lombard kingdoms. For them, he composed his rule, which spread his influence throughout Western Europe and influenced successive rules. His rule testifies to consumption of beer as a regular drink and its acceptable status. The spilling of beer was treated as a transgression worthy of penance. The expansion of brewing reached women monasteries as well. Manual labor in the sphere of brewing was preserved also for nuns. A rule for nuns, composed in the 7th century by an unknown author in the spirit of Saint Benedict's rule, advises labor in the bakery and brewery in turns to increase silence. The rule testifies to the fact that brewing in early medieval monasteries became ordinary and enough widespread manufacture. At least one convent had a facility specifically for brewing beer. It was called Braxatorium. Brewery in a monastic brewery was not only accepted throughout Europe, but also enriched with creativity. During the Middle Ages, brewers used all kinds of additives to their beer. They were known as gruit, the white variety of herbs. The use of herbs was supplanted and obsoleted by the introduction of hops. Monasteries were among the first to use hops. With the growth of the use of hops, new technologies developed. In times of Charles the Great, large monasteries were built, which usually became intellectual and technological centers of large-scale brewing. The fact is that brewing became the mark of new Christianized society and an element of identity of civilized people. Author of Life of Columbanus, Jonas of Bobbio, defined both the areas and people who drank beer. These people live around the ocean, that is Gaul, Brittany, Ireland, Germany, and also certain other people except Scots and barbarians. Beer was no longer barbaric. Moreover, Jonas in Life of Vedast reported that beer was even blessed by Bishop Vedast as an element of meal. Now I would like to come to conclusion on the general status of brewing in Christian thought. The social status of beer and brewing appeared to be very close to that of wine and viticulture. Medieval Christianity intensified positive attitude towards beer from acceptance it as an everyday drink to perceiving it as a God's gift. Jonas of Bobbio in Life of Columbanus noticed that the supernatural power once preserved beer from spilling. In other words, beer seemed to be considered as value in the eyes of God. There are also numerous monastic stories concerning the miracles of multiplication of beer. Miracles show not only the importance of beer as an everyday drink in monasteries, but also its approbation by God. Beer acquired official recognition in monastic life throughout Europe and was treated as a substitute for wine. The rule of Saint Chrodegang from the 8th century indicates that beer should compensate the shortage of wine. The first synod of Aachen in August of 816 recommends to compensate the lack of wine by a greater quantity of beer. This is a particularly important point, which suggests that brewing was a craft which acquired the status very close to that of viticulture and became one of the symbols of responsible transformation of nature by humans in medieval Christianity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for a very inspiring presentation. I think it has become very clear that as the quality of beer grew, so the appreciation of beer by the fathers of the church also increased. And of course, if the fathers like Cyril of Alexandria had such a good beer as Sahti, the Finnish one, or actually Ukraine has quite good beers, including the one in Lviv, Lvivske pivo, Lviv beer is quite good. Probably Cyril's judgment about beer would have been different. Now it's time for questions. Yes, Emil, please. Oh, you have your beer. And Benedict liked beer. Yes, Benedict did like beer.
Дуже дякую.
Thank you.
Дуже приємно. Після початку війни навчився трохи української мови для вас. Ми усі з вами.
Дякуємо.
Дякуємо.
І запрошу вас на Сахти на пиво до Фінляндії.
Thank you very much.
So to my Finnish colleagues, just a thank you and an invitation whenever it's possible. We will invite all our Ukrainian friends for the Finnish Sahti and a Finnish beer here to Finland. Hopefully also we can in the future start the meetings here and there for Finnish and Ukrainian beer and wine and tea. Actually, it's tea at the moment here. To have these meetings not only online but also in person. So we have been very much with you all year, and it's a wonderful occasion, historic occasion to have this symposium. So just thank you to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Antti?
Yes. Thank you, Alexander, for your fine presentation. I'm interested especially the context of this presentation, because you began it with reference to Isaiah 19, and if I have understood right, only in this chapter there is reference to be in the Septuagint, and this passage in Isaiah 19 has been quite important in early Christian reception, because the first verses 1 to 4 have been understood so that the gospel of Christ was moving from Palestine to Egypt, and the country was Christianized, and of course in that context perhaps all references to judgment may have been taken seriously too, and beer is one of them according to Isaiah 19. Have you any idea? Is there any discussion concerning this early patristic period, where the critical attitude toward beer was emphasized? In which way it was related to this idea that wine was something positive? We have so many passages in also in the book of Isaiah, which wine is very positive, but beer in that passage is negative, that it could illustrate perhaps some kind of ordinary people life or something. Perhaps beer was not so was perhaps cheaper drink than wine or something like that, and it could be in some way related to this kind of, let's say, sinful life of Egyptians. I'm mainly interested to hear if you have more to say about this starting point, beer as negative.
Thank you very much. As far as I know, Isaiah is the only reference in Church Fathers concerning beer and brewing. And Church Fathers were first of all pastors who accepted culture of people that were Christianized. And if I understood your question, was beer for them good or bad or evil? The beer was neutral for them. It was only a gift of God also, but I think that they accepted beer while they accepted cultures of people who were Christianized, and there was need of time to accept beer in the same level as wine. I don't know if I answered the question.
Okay. Yeah. I was mainly interested that the beer has been presented something negative in Isaiah 19, and it was and is it some is there any discussion concerning this?
No, there was no any discussion concerning this fragment, because the topic of beer was not at the center of fathers of the church.
Yeah.
Especially in the 4th century.
Okay. Thanks.
But I'm glad that it is now the topic for patristic discussions, and actually beer is when you go to the Oxford Patristic Conference, all the patrologists would go to the pubs around the Christchurch and other places of venue, and they would drink British ale, not exactly sahti, but some kinds of beer. So beer is a part of the modern patristic culture, that's for sure. Any other question? No, it seems to be that we are we don't have questions, and we are very close to concluding our session, our conference. I think it was quite a success. I think the format was rather unusual to have like two nations patristic committees coming together and presenting their papers. I hope we could continue like that, and I just congratulate everyone who contributed to the session with the presentations, with the questions, answers, comments, and so forth. And I just give word to Harry and Annie Maria to say the final blessing for us.
Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you especially Professor Cyril for arranging this with us and being such an active member of the arranging committee. Thank you so much, everybody. It was a fantastic experience. for me personally, to just listen to you and to learn new things that we here in Finland, up here, wouldn't necessarily think about. It's very enlightening. Thank you so much, and it's a great great concept to continue to have these kinds of sessions together with you. I wholeheartedly agree with Professor here. So thank you from my side, and then we'll hear from President Anni-Maria. Thank you.
I just want to thank you all, and above all, Cyril and Harry, for organizing this wonderful event. It has been really a pleasure to hear all these presentations and discussions, and I hope we will continue with this kind of connection and hopefully sometimes also meet live somewhere. So thank you for everybody.
Thank you. And I'll be happy to share the link for this session with everyone. So feel free also to share it as widely as possible. So all the best. Stay safe, be safe, and take care of yourself.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do pobачення.
До побачення.
All the best. Bye.